We are live. Hello, 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 everyone. I am Anna Marsh, and today I'm going to be joined by nutritional therapist Francesca Liparoti. And this is the first of our series of talks that we are going to be doing together to talk about perimenopause, happy and healthy hormones after 40 in honor of Menopause Awareness Month. So I'm just going to check that I can get Francesca on board with me. That she'll pop up in a moment. Please bear with while we deal with all of the technology. And I think we are live. Hello, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. It's so lovely to have you here today and to see your beautiful face.
And you, the light in your room looks lovely compared to mine. It's a bit dim, a bit
Well,
dark.
actually, I've got the blinds closed because we get so much light which comes through from the windows. But I think I've just got a new phone and it's got a good camera.
Yeah,
Although I'm very unhappy because the camera is so good, it's picking up all my wrinkles and my age spots. So, not
so
so good.
pretty. But I like the
Anyway.
room.
Anyway, thank you so much, Francesca, for joining me. For those of you who don't know, Francesca is an incredible nutritional therapist, but she's also one of my very best friends. And we spend so much time talking about nutrition, supplements, metabolic pathways, hormones, just everything. We totally geek out on this stuff. So it's really such a pleasure, Francesca, to have you here live on Instagram so we can talk about it some more. So just to give everybody an idea of what to expect today, Francesca's going to do most of the talking. This area, hormones after the age of 40, is something that she's personally very passionate about in her business, whereas I'm more like energy, mitochondria. Francesca is the hormones lady. So I'm really just going to be facilitating this conversation and give Francesca the opportunity to showcase some of her wisdom. We're going to be doing 4 talks over the next month. So today is really just an overview of the hormonal cycle, of things that can go wrong after after the age of 40 or sometimes even before. And then we'll be able to go into more detail into the specific hormones in the other talks coming up in the future. So, Francesca, over to you. Where shall we begin?
Well, I think really just with a definition of, well, I'd say a definition of perimenopause, but also some women have no idea what, they've never heard of the term, or if they have heard the term, they don't know, they just don't think it applies to them. Because maybe the menopause at the end sounds like, oh, well, that's probably something when I'm maybe 48, 49. So I think it'd be great to first start with what perimenopause is, and then allow women who might resonate with that to say, oh, okay, I can see how that applies to me. Because it's just something that I've noticed, though. I talk about perimenopause a lot and kind of take for granted that a woman in that phase would go, oh, that's me. But if they don't even know that they're in that phase because they don't know what the phase is, then they're never going to, read the post or read the blog and find that information. So I think it's great just to specify what it is.
Yeah, totally. And that was what was really interesting to me, even with this is October is Menopause Awareness Month. It's not Perimenopause
Yeah,
Awareness Month.
such
And
thing.
menopause is actually just one day. It is the day, 365 days from the day you had your last period as a woman. And then every day after that day is postmenopause.
Yeah.
So really this should be called Perimenopause Awareness Month. So why don't you just go straight in and explain what is that gap? There's all these changes that are happening in the body that lead us up to that one day, which is menopause. So you go into it in a bit more detail.
I love that as well, because as I'm going to explain, most of the symptoms that people class as menopause are happening in perimenopause. And then, as you said, postmenopause is when things start to slowly, gradually calm down. But we talk about menopause as if it's this massive long-term event. And like you said, it's a day. It's what's happening before that's really important. So yeah, I mean, perimenopause is basically the anywhere between the 2 to 12 years, very slow journey where your body has started its slow journey towards menopause. So that clue there, you know, 2 to 12 years, you could think, okay, let's say the average woman is going into menopause around 51. So the 2 to 12 years could be 48, but it could also be 38 if we're doing 12 years before. But it's more common that every woman from around age 35 is starting to move into that stage already. So that's when it's perimenopause is basically when the communication between your brain, which talks to your ovaries the whole way through your reproductive years, your menstruating years, your brain is communicating with your ovaries to release the hormones at the different times in the cycle. So perimenopause is when that communication starts to change, and I'd say break down a little bit. They kind of don't talk to each other as well as they were during the reproductive years. Sometimes the ovaries are ignoring the brain, or the brain isn't telling the ovaries to do anything, you know, vice versa. So that usually does start for most women around 35, and those changes can be really, really tiny. So 35, 36, 37. For example, I'm 41, nearly 42. For me, between 35 and 39, I really didn't notice anything, but there was probably something really small. It's just so small I didn't notice it. I've only started noticing changes from around 39 and definitely 40. But some women are seeing these changes 36, 37, and it could be something like the length of their cycles was a day longer than normal, if it's always regular, or the length of their periods is shorter or longer or heavier. Usually it's something to do with heavier periods, so heavier flow or painful flow, breast pain that maybe you didn't get that much before. And a lot of it as well, sometimes a lot of experts refer to perimenopause as our second puberty. So if we think of when we first started having periods as a teen, and this is definitely the case for me, mine was so painful and so heavy, and there was this big build up to it, and then when it came, it was just like the pain on day 1 and day 2 was sometimes it was excruciating, and it was so heavy for about 7 days. That settled down around, I can't even remember actually when it started to settle down, maybe 17, 18, probably around 17. So I had about 2 years of it, 3 years of it. And I think most women would say the same if they thought about it. So the reason we talk about perimenopause as a second puberty is because it's a similar hormonal change that's happening again around your late 30s and onwards that was happening in when we first started our periods as a teen. And it's really that the adjustment period between your brain and your ovaries, trying to, like when you first started your periods, it was a year or two of adjustment. And once everything was nicely calibrated, your periods weren't as heavy anymore. They weren't as painful for most women. Obviously, some women are unlucky enough to have issues continuously. So that's more or less what's happened. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I just want to say, like, that I'm turning 37 in November. So I turned 35 about 2 years ago. And I almost to the day from when I turned 35, I started to notice changes in my cycle. And obviously I've had other things going on, you know, with chronic fatigue and all of that. But since I turned 35, I've definitely noticed a change in my cycle, which was always 28 days like clockwork. Yes, I've had issues with, you know, heavy and painful periods in the past. I'm quite estrogen dominant genetically, but the length in my cycle definitely started to change from the age of 35. And I think that's really important as we go into the rest of what we're going to talk about today, is that this is not just for women over the age of 40. This is for all women, because the more we know about our hormones and the more we start supporting our bodies, and the earlier we can do that in our lives, then that's going to be positive for the longer term outcomes and then our transition through perimenopause.
Yeah.
So next thing I want to ask you, I know the answers, I'm pretending I don't know, is what is actually changing? So what does a healthy cycle look like? And then when you're talking about these changes, what's actually happening?
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So the healthy, or let's say normal cycle, a natural cycle that would be happening from all the way throughout our menstruating years up to perimenopause starting, is just a natural ebb and flow of estrogen and progesterone all throughout the month. So let's say day 1, of the cycle, which is day 1 of your period, both of the hormones are pretty low. They're not at their lowest, but they're low. progesterone being lower. And then as your period progresses, let's say comes towards the end, so roughly on average around day 5, but obviously this is just an example. For some people it could be day 7. Those estrogen starts to climb, it starts to rise. That's when we might notice that we start to feel a bit better. So my energy is on the floor at day 1, and it starts to slowly creep up. So around day 5, estrogen starts to increase, it starts to rise, and then just before ovulation, which in an average 28-day cycle is around day 14, that's when estrogen surges. So we have a real high spike of estrogen, and that's the point where we probably feel really good, you know, really outgoing, really sociable, like we'll get things done and have more energy. And then we ovulate, and as a result, hopefully, and then as a result of ovulation, we produce progesterone, and that starts to slowly kind of we produce a lot of it as a result of ovulation, but it starts to increase throughout that luteal phase, so the second half of the cycle, from ovulation day up to the start of the next cycle. That's called the luteal phase, and that's when progesterone is rising as a result of having produced it at ovulation. And estrogen starts to drop once we don't get pregnant. It then starts to drop, and it carries on declining, and just before we come on our next period, which is day 1 of the next cycle, it's at its real lowest, and then progesterone has started to drop as well around those days. So that's normal. That's like a normal natural cycle. And as I alluded to, we'll feel differently at different parts of that cycle. Knowing that can be really powerful, but that's a whole other session we could do. But during perimenopause, the communication, as I said, where the brain is telling the ovaries what to produce and when, is starting to break down a little bit. So we no longer have that natural flow that I just talked about. And it could be that estrogen, really the main thing with perimenopause, well, 2 main things, is that estrogen starts to go on more of a roller coaster ride. So before it was a natural ebb and flow, this time it's a roller coaster. So it's just kind of up and down. Sometimes it can be 3 times higher than it's ever been before at different points in the cycle, when it shouldn't even be high, or when it should be high, but it's like 3 times higher than it should be, followed by a massive crash. So this huge dip, when it should be maybe low at that point, but not that low. And that's kind of happening the whole time through the cycle. And then the other thing that's happening is that progesterone levels are declining the further we kind of move into perimenopause. And again, we're going to do a separate session on progesterone and a separate one on estrogen. But the reason for that decline in progesterone is all to do with ovulation. So ovulation was what's happening every single month during your normal reproductive years. But when we move into perimenopause, ovulation just becomes a little bit harder to achieve every single month, because it can be hard to achieve sometimes anyway, because there's various factors that can block it and get in the way of it, which we'll talk about on that session. But it just gets harder and harder during perimenopause, and harder the further we move in. So, 42, 43, by the time you're 47, it's even harder, and you've probably got really much lower levels than you had at 38, 39. So those 2 things together, estrogen on a roller coaster, progesterone being low, are just a bit of a nightmare for symptoms. So they'll cause these kind of worsening, I would say, of PMS. So if you had PMS before, it's just worse now. It's kind of like hormonal chaos, which that's the truth of it. But I really don't like to say, oh, it's hormonal chaos and symptoms are terrible, because it just, for some women, they'll just think, oh, great. There is loads we can do about it, which is obviously what we are going to talk about today. But in truth, it is hormonal chaos, but I just hate that word because it sounds so negative.
I think it buys into the stigma that society has set for women, which is, oh, shame, poor you, your hormones are a mess. Good luck with that. Just go and suffer for the next 2 to 12 years, or however long it's going to be for you. And I think one of the most important messages to get across is that it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
So, it's helpful, first of all, just to understand what's happening in a normal cycle. As you say, we get that rise in estrogen, which generates ovulation, which is essential for progesterone production. And if we're not ovulating for whatever reason, and we're not getting that progesterone production, that's going to be problematic in terms of some of the symptoms we experience. But there's a lot we can do to support our bodies so that we have adequate estrogen for ovulation, and that we can support progesterone production as well. And that's what we're going to talk about in the upcoming sessions over the next couple of weeks. But just kind of generally speaking, today is like a kind of, I would say, like a bird's eye view of everything that's going on. If someone is experiencing cyclical symptoms, suspects maybe they could be related to perimenopause, where do you start? Client comes to you, they say they're just all over the place. Maybe they're having increased cramping or PMS symptoms, increased breast pain, low energy, migraines, headaches. Where do you start with someone like that?
So in a nutshell, I start with lifestyle habits first. Obviously, you'd think as a nutritionist, you're going to go to the diet first. And although that is a huge part of it, and of course that will be discussed straight away, it's the lifestyle piece that's the most important thing. And that's definitely my experience as well. The only thing that really works to keep my symptoms under control is my lifestyle habits. So you could have the most amazing diet. So let's say I get my client's diet absolutely perfect and they're doing that all the time, but you know, spot on, but then their lifestyle habits are just not in favor of your hormones being in balance. It's not going to help. It's going to be helpful, but it's not going to really change things. So it's definitely the lifestyle stuff that I start with first. It kind of depends on the symptoms as well, because if it's a client that's really showing signs of what we would say is estrogen dominance, being that estrogen is so high and progesterone is so much lower, that estrogen is like dominating the show, those sorts of symptoms like breast pain, heavy periods, obviously we want to relieve those pretty much as soon as possible. So we'll definitely look at the diet there, and also, which we'll talk about in the estrogen session, but we also look at things like chemicals that they could be exposing themselves to on a day-to-day basis through creams and tap water, for example, that hasn't been filtered, household cleaning products and things like that, that can have these chemicals that can disrupt your hormones and increase that estrogen load and just make those symptoms worse. And I have actually done a post on hormone disrupting chemicals a couple of days ago, I think, on my feed, just because I don't want anyone to go, oh my God, chemicals, what am I doing? Like, it's not that, you know, scary, but just something to address. But really it would be the lifestyle piece, because when we talk about progesterone in more detail, the biggest blocker to ovulation is stress, and ovulation is how we make progesterone. So you want to balance those hormones. You want to address the fact that estrogen is potentially just running the show because it's so much higher and progesterone is so much lower, but you also want to start balancing estrogen, because another thing about progesterone, there's so many amazing things that it does, but it's a period lightening hormone. So if it's on the floor and your periods are really heavy and you're, you know, painful, then that needs to be looked at straight away. But it would definitely be lifestyle, because that's the biggest, stress is the biggest blocker to ovulating. But the reason I say that as well is because stress is also things like how you exercise, which we don't tend to put in a lot of women don't sort of put that in the stress bucket. They see it as all the kind of horrible things that are happening. But actually, even just how you're exercising can be one of those stresses. And for me, it's definitely been did you want to say something there?
No, you keep going.
Oh, no, I was just going to say about my experience, which I've told you about a million times. We always talk about it, is how I used to exercise in my earlier 30s compared to how I exercise now. It's still the same in terms of I've always lifted weights as part of a kind of like as the core foundation of what I do. But in my earlier 30s, I was doing a lot more intense stuff, and I had a lot of high intensity sprint intervals and really like more powerful weightlifting sessions. Whereas now they have to be different. It's not that you suddenly can't do what you used to do, but you do need to think about the way that you train. Like, for example, long distance running 3 or 4 times a week and things like that can be really unhelpful as you move closer into perimenopause. So for me at now almost 42, those sorts of things just won't work. So it's really, that's what I would address first, is the whole looking at sleep, you know, what kind of sleep routine they've got, how much sleep they get, the stress that's going on, how can it be reduced? Can stuff be delegated? If not, and as well, how do we manage the stress, and how do we add little habits in, really simple habits every day that can just help the body to deal with their lifestyle better?
Yeah, I always like to think of stress as like a cup. And, you know, for example, somebody who, you know, had a really fantastic time in utero when they're in their mom's belly, and then a really seamless birth, and grew up in a home with lots of love and stability, and just this is what I call nervous system privilege. Someone with a very privileged nervous system who is then very financially secure, doing something that they love in a supportive relationship, you know, they can probably transition through perimenopause and still be able to maybe train intensity because they have that resilience in their system. But then you've maybe got somebody who's, you know, been actually probably chronically stressed most of their life. And then there's maybe, you know, other stresses coming in if they run their own business, if, you know, their parents are becoming elderly and they're becoming carers for their parents, or just stuff. We know that there's an abundance of stuff that can happen in life, and it's usually not just one thing. It's that like total load, and how full is the cup getting, and is that cup beginning to overflow? And if your cup is starting to overflow with stress, it's identifying what are the smallest things that you can do that can make the biggest difference. Because sometimes when we're overwhelmed, it's like, oh, there's so much that I need to do. Where do I even begin? But it's just like what feels easy and will make you feel better. And you've mentioned looking at your exercise, because sometimes exercise can be a coping mechanism for people to exercise more and more, the more and more stress they feel. And that was definitely me. And sleep, so sleep routine. Sleep is the tide that raises all the ships. So whenever we can get an hour or two more sleep, that's always great. But what are other things that you do, or other things you recommend or look for when you're supporting someone with these lifestyle factors?
Yeah, really start, like you say, looking at the life. It's like this life load that it's different for all of us. So looking at that individual's life load. So what do they have in their cup? Where is it overflowing, and can those overflowing things be minimized in some way? Is there, you know, for most women in their 40s, let's say, when they do have this cup of life load stuff, a lot of it can't be changed. Let's say it's children, whether they're young, there's different stresses that come with small children, and there's different stresses that come with teenage children and more adult children. So let's say they've got that. They may have, like you said, elderly parents who aren't well. They might be worried about them. They might be caring for them. So these sorts of things can't be taken away, because they're not going to turn their back on those things, understandably. But it would be looking at other things that they're maybe not doing or are doing that would be adding to that load. And that's where it could be something really simple, like in the morning. So, for example, I was talking to a client a few weeks ago. She gets up in the morning. I said, what time do you need to leave the house? She told me, and I said, what time do you get up? She gets up 25 minutes before she needs to leave the house. She has to get ready, leave the house, drop her daughter to school, and get to work. And I said, like, how do you feel when you get to work? And obviously she said, oh, I feel absolutely exhausted and frazzled and stressed, and I'm just about on time. So we talked over a few weeks, actually, and now she's doing it, about her waking up an hour earlier instead of 25 minutes earlier than she needs to leave the house. And she has fed back already that she feels completely different, not just in the morning, but for the rest of the day. She sleeps better, she feels calmer. And I definitely used to do that years and years ago. I used to rush off every single morning, running down my track, because I wanted more time in bed, and I didn't realize the detrimental effect it was having. Luckily I was like late 20s, so it wasn't too bad. But little things like that can make such a difference. Do they, how much do they get out into natural daylight of the day? Do they ever spend any time in nature? Like, do they see green? Do they see trees? Do they have a park that they never go to? And is it always just in their car and in the office and in the house? And so tiny little things like that, because that makes a huge difference as well to your overall well-being, doesn't it? We know that. So small things, what can be done, and also, what kind of exercise are they doing? They might say, oh, I run 3 times a week and go to spin class once a week. And if you're happy to have those 4 slots every week in your diary where you exercise, how can we make those 4 slots more in favor of balancing your hormones and calming your stress system, so that you're still doing that, you've still got that routine, because clearly it's in there, but it's working for your body, not against it. So these things can make a huge difference just in the first couple of weeks.
Yeah, totally. I'll just also share an example from a client I'm working with at the moment in my More Energy program. The very first module in that program is nervous system. So it's all about lowering that stress load and supporting resilience of the system. And she's just been taking like a 1 minute break every hour at work where she just breathes for 1 minute. And she said, "Oh, you wouldn't think that 1 minute would make such a difference, but 1 minute over the course of the day is like 8 minutes, 9 minutes, 10 minutes.
Mm.
And it's just those little resets throughout the day that means that when she gets to the end of the day, she's less exhausted, less frazzled, less completely highly strung from just winding up her nervous system the whole day. So sometimes we think, no, I don't have time to do like an hour yoga class or whatever it is, but just small habits and tweaks to your routine and your lifestyle can really start to have a positive impact on the nervous system and then that total stress load.
Yeah, it's all about the accumulative effect, isn't it? Like if someone does 2 minutes, they get up in the morning and they just turn and sit on the end of their bed, feet on the floor, before they even stand up and do 2 minutes of deep breathing, meditative breathing, and then stand up and get ready. Even that, even just those 2 minutes can be huge. Like by the end of the week, that's however many minutes, I'm not going to work it out, 14 minutes of deep breathing that you weren't doing before. So
Mm.
it does all have, it all adds up.
Yeah, totally. So
Yeah.
we've talked about the first thing you go in and do when you're looking at calming the hormonal chaos is to support people with that life load. How can they create little changes, micro habits that reduce the life load? What comes next? What else could someone be thinking about who's listening to this and wants to support their body?
So I think we mentioned sleep as part of the whole life load thing, and we can go into more detail with sleep when we talk about progesterone as well. But I think once I've looked at lifestyle, exercise, how can we tweak those things? What can we add in? What can we take away? Um, I would then, this is the dreaded word, but alcohol would need to be addressed as well, because again, we are going to always get to nutrition, of course. But again, if I give someone the most amazing guidance food wise, but they are drinking a certain amount of alcohol throughout the week, it's the food advice will be helpful, but it's not going to be game changing enough in the way that it would be if we just got rid of some of the things that are just really causing more chaos. And it's, so many women don't want to hear it, but unfortunately alcohol just does increase that chaos, because it just has such a strong impact on your liver. Every time there's any alcohol present, your liver has to prioritize that. It has to prioritize the detoxification of that alcohol. And your liver is the one, well, not the one, the main, one of the biggest organs in your body that's dealing with the clearance, the breakdown, I should say, the metabolism, the breakdown of your used estrogen. So once the body uses estrogen, it gets sent, the liver needs to break it down so that it can leave the body permanently. We don't want to keep used hormones in the body. And this is happening all the time. It's like all day, every day. And your liver's breaking it down, hopefully in a nice, effective way. And then it's getting sent out of the body permanently via a bowel movement, basically via your gut. So that it's your liver that's doing all this work all the time to clear out your old and used estrogen, which is happening all the time. If the alcohol is going in too often and too high amounts, that process gets halted every time there's alcohol present. And that, like as we were just saying about the accumulative effect of little things in a day, is the cumulative effect of that as well, where your liver's just, how often is it being halted, that process of clearing out your estrogen and breaking it down for you. So, and then that can just end up with that used estrogen being sent back into the body. It's not been broken down properly, or it has been broken down, but then it just gets reabsorbed and sent back into the system, and increasing that load again of estrogen. And then your symptoms just keep going, the heavy painful periods, the breast pain, even things like, we haven't talked about some of the other horrible symptoms, but it's migraines or headaches, irritability, mood issues, weight gain. So weight gain is probably one of the biggest symptoms that I think women over the age of 35 start to notice, and mostly around their middle. I think a lot of women will agree with that. It's mostly around the middle, and it can be really frustrating. And you think, what is going on? Everything I did in my 20s and my early 30s just isn't working anymore. I'm getting, just gaining weight. It's all around my middle. And again, there's a huge link between that and estrogen detoxification. So alcohol just has such a huge, too much of an impact for it to be allowed to kind of stay, if it's too much.
Yeah, so when you were just raised the point of alcohol, I was watching our live viewers and they just suddenly took a dip. I don't think it had anything to do with you mentioning alcohol. It just amused me at the time. Um, I'd say alcohol is a tricky one. I mean, the other thing is that it also impacts sleep. So
Mm.
sometimes people will use alcohol as a tool to help them calm down, so that maybe they can get to sleep at night if they've had a very stressful day. But the quality of sleep that we get from when we drink alcohol is not actually, it's kind of like a light sleep. We don't necessarily access the REM and the deep sleep that we really need to access for the body to restore and repair. But also alcohol can negatively impact sleep for some as well. And I think the biggest thing I want to say here is that if someone is willing to acknowledge that maybe their alcohol consumption is a problem for them, that it's just really understanding that it can very often be used as a coping mechanism. So when we're talking about this life load and this nervous system dysregulation, is if someone is feeling overloaded and dysregulated, alcohol can be a way for them to cope. So instead of now just taking all the alcohol out and then you're left without any coping mechanisms, it's also really important that if we take away something that supports us, even if it's not actually good for us, we do need to put in something that can create more support for the body, and so that we're not just left dysregulated, not knowing what to do.
Yeah, and also it's not even about complete like abstinence, you know, like giving things up. It's just about looking at the, you know, if someone said to me, oh, I have a small glass of wine 3 times a week, I'm not going to touch that. There's nothing wrong with that. That's absolutely fine. It's if somebody was to say they have half a bottle of wine most nights, or, you know, a whole bottle once a week. I'd even prefer like a glass 3 or 4 times a week, one small glass 3 or 4 times a week with your food, for example, than that one bottle once a week. So it would just be looking at how often, how much. Okay, where could you reduce if need be? Like I said, if it's just one small glass a few times a week, there's no need to address that really. Especially, you know, maybe if they wanted to make loads of changes and then later on consider they don't want that anymore, great. But it wouldn't be like, oh, it's an emergency, we need to get rid of all that, because it's your liver's probably okay to break down a small glass of wine, for example, just use wine as an example, in one sitting. It's just if you're giving it much more than that, also the time, like the liver's much happier at breaking down your alcohol at around 5 p.m. 6 p.m. But after that, like late into the evening, if you're having it just before bed, for example, it's a lot harder, and then it does have more of an impact on your sleep, of course. So it would be looking at it rather than saying, oh, you drink alcohol, you need to stop. That's absolutely not the case at all. It's just how it's being done.
Yeah, and I mean, also red wine, for example, has got all your lovely polyphenols. Not that you can't get them from other sources, but you've got all your polyphenols in your red wine, which can be good. You know, they can be neuroprotective potentially. So it's like about that overall balance. And I think,
Mm.
yeah, we'd like people to just explore, like, what is your relationship with this?
Yeah.
And if you feel that the relationship is healthy and balanced, cool, keep going. But if you sense that there might be some sort of dysregulation going on there, then to get some support around that.
Yeah.
So we've talked about life load, we've talked about exercise, we've talked about alcohol. What else is on the list? What else do we need to chat through?
Well, obviously it's the food. As two nutrition, we haven't even gone there yet, but the food, the diet advice is really all geared towards a blood sugar balancing diet. There are lifestyle factors that impact blood sugar, but if we're just talking about food, that would be the first place to start. So you're probably very similar to me when you look at a food diary, for example, that a client, when you first meet a client, it's the first thing that comes into our mind is, oh, this is not, you know, in favor of balancing blood sugar levels. And that's something that's the foundation of everything anyway. It's the foundation of good health. But when you're in perimenopause, the body is so much more likely, I'd say, to be what we will know as insulin resistance. It's more likely in that phase because of the fluctuation in hormones.
Yeah, and just to explain for people listening that that means that maybe the amount of carbohydrate you could eat in your 20s is not necessarily the same as how much carbohydrate you eat in your 30s and then your 40s and so on. And especially if you're reducing how much exercise you're doing to support your nervous system, you know, there needs to be some give and take there with your carbohydrate and food consumption generally.
Yeah, exactly. So it would be looking at how much protein. That would be the first thing I'm looking at, is protein. Obviously carbohydrates hugely needs to be addressed, but I would want to see that there's, because it becomes easier to address carbohydrates if you address protein first, in my experience. So if somebody's diet is relatively low in protein and even not particularly high in carbs, let's say, if it's low in protein, it will be it's a carb heavy diet. It's just going to be, and that will be blood sugar disruptive. And it's basically that, obviously I'm not telling Anna this because you know, but for everyone listening, blood sugar regulation, what that basically means is how much sugar is in, or glucose is in your bloodstream at any one time. And if it's too high above the ideal amount, it creates a response where insulin, which is your main kind of blood sugar regulating hormone, has to come along and move that excess sugar, the higher sugar, out of your bloodstream quite quickly, which is fantastic. It has to do that, it's great. But then we're left with a sharp dip in blood sugar levels because it's cleared it all out so fast. And then we start to increase, that will spike cortisol levels, which is the stress hormone. So basically what is happening is we have this kind of up and down roller coaster, blood sugar roller coaster, that we'll be riding all day. And physiologically, that's basically disrupting energy levels, cognition, mood. So you'll have low mood, irritability. We hate in a day, the productivity, dips. Yeah, cravings, massive. That's a huge one, and the low energy and fatigue. So it's just absolutely huge, and that's really governed by what is on your plate, or box, whatever it is you eat from. Morning, lunch and dinner, and then to balance that out so that we don't have those, if we can, to reduce those spikes, it's really about having enough protein on that plate, enough fiber as well. So let's say all the vegetables, that's the best place to get your fiber on your plate. And then looking at, and obviously always some fat, but the carbohydrate, so where is that coming from? If it's coming from a white flour wrap, for example, or quite a lot of pasta, let's say, and just a tiny bit of protein, or a big baguette with a small filling, that will probably be, there's quite an imbalanced plate. So you would probably find that you get these spikes in blood sugar. Whereas if you have optimal protein and good quality carbohydrates that break down much slower into glucose, and they don't break down into as much glucose as these other kind of carbohydrates, let's say sweet potato or buckwheat or oats or brown rice, for example, those, and just a smaller amount than you might have usually wanted in the past, that would be far more balanced. So you wouldn't have those blood sugar fluctuations. So that would be the absolute first place to start, because those blood sugar dysregulation has such a huge impact on all of the symptoms that perimenopause brings. And one being weight gain, which is what most women want to control in that period.
Yeah, it's like our food choices have the ability to either create a roller coaster with blood sugar, or to create just a really nice, soft, undulating blood sugar response. And that if we're creating a roller coaster with blood sugar, we create a roller coaster with stress hormones, and then that creates the roller coaster ride of perimenopause. So lots of roller coasters going on.
Yeah,
and not fun. They're not the fun kind.
Not the fun roller coaster. I don't think they're fun anyway. But no, but your work is obviously so heavily focused on blood sugar. You are the blood sugar expert, and
I'm just sensitive about it, but I think that's my own personal experience, because I wasn't your obvious candidate for blood sugar dysregulation. I wasn't overweight, I was exercising, but when I actually looked at the data, I was pretty insulin resistant.
Yeah, exactly. And you have muscle mass, all the things that you wouldn't think. So your work is just so complementary to that kind of foundation of hormone health as well.
Yeah, and there was one other thing I wanted to say about blood sugar, insulin resistance. Oh, coming back to the stress piece. Um, what I actually just want to share a little anecdote for the listeners, just to say, just to circle back around to the lifestyle factors. So I have a client who I've been working with, and we were actually getting her to measure her blood sugar levels after her meals and kind of really track that quite closely. And it wasn't good. And her diet was fantastic. We had, she was eating enough protein. We'd really reduced the carbs, great food quality, but her blood sugar was just all over the show. And then we did some work on her digestion and some supplements, and it did get better. But actually, the biggest thing that's ended up making the difference in the end is that life load and reducing.
I was just, as you were saying, I thought, yeah, stress.
Yeah, so yeah, we've got to get the food right for blood sugar balance. But when we get the food right and blood sugar is still off, then we have to start thinking out of the box.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And that's why we said, obviously, food is huge, the biggest part for blood sugar, but there are lifestyle habits that, like sleep, lack of sleep will just, you have your Oura ring, so I'm sure you know that. Well, no, sorry, your Oura ring doesn't measure your blood sugar, but if you had, when you were measuring it like all the time, I'm sure you noticed that from a sleep deprived day. Alcohol, caffeine, too much, we're not demonizing caffeine, but again, done in certain ways can impact that as well.
Yeah, good. So we've talked about exercise, we talked about life load, we talked a little bit about sleep. We'll go into that in more detail. We've talked about blood sugar regulation and the importance of diet. Anything else people need to know before we wrap up?
Those are the biggest places to start. Like, if we, obviously you just summarized it, but really, yeah, lifestyle, looking at that life load cup, where is it overflowing, how can you change that, what sort of little habits can you bring in just to help your body to deal better with the life load, because we probably can't change a lot of it in your 40s. How are you exercising, how can that be optimized towards healthy, balancing your hormones and supporting them. Sleep, diet, yeah, I mean that's more or less everything to want to address. But then you want to dive deeper into how to really balance estrogen, how to optimize production of progesterone every month. And that's why if we dived into both of those hormones now, we'd probably be here for a couple of hours, so we'll split that up and do that in the other sessions. But yeah, there are different lifestyle and diet habits helpful for balancing estrogen. They all benefit everything anyway, but then there's a kind of separate thing to talk about when it comes to optimizing progesterone, because it's about helping the body to make progesterone versus helping the body to balance estrogen, which is on a roller coaster.
Yeah. So I actually have a question for you, but before I ask it, what I'm going to do is I just want to invite anybody who's listening live and who wants to ask any questions, just please pop them in the comments box. We'll be very happy to answer. Otherwise, if you're watching this on the replay, you can always comment and we'll come back to you maybe in the next session or just through Instagram. But I was just wondering what your opinion was on hormone testing for women in perimenopause, considering that this is a time of life where the hormones are fluctuating. So if you test, like, how do you know if you're going to get it right? I have my thoughts around this, but I'm just curious what you would advise someone if there's like, I think I'm perimenopausal, should I test?
Yeah, well, there isn't really any testing that can be done to, like, let's say, diagnose or confirm. I don't say diagnose, but confirm perimenopause. There isn't one that you can do. It's not really like that. It's a transitional phase that's very natural, that your body is going through for about, like we said, 10, 15 years even, as it starts that slow process, that slow journey towards perimenopause. So there isn't really a test for it. You wouldn't get a test done, let's say at 42, and say, yeah, I'm definitely in perimenopause because of this, because also the picture that you would see in those test results at 42 could be similar at another part of your life, because what's happening in perimenopause is not to say that those things can't happen earlier on. So for example, we mentioned ovulation is how we make progesterone, and we start to ovulate less and less in perimenopause, but you could still be in your 20s and not ovulate for various reasons, or your earlier 30s. So again, and you could still be estrogen dominant in those years. So you could,
or just going through a really stressful time. I've had clients go, oh, I think I'm having an early menopause. I'm like, no, you're just stressed.
stress,
Yeah.
so you and things like, exactly, yeah. So no, there isn't a test for it. It's really going by symptoms, changes in your cycle, like we mentioned. So longer or shorter cycles, longer or shorter periods, anxiety, noticing like, again, but that could be all sorts of other things as well. But the lack of that loss of progesterone is really causing irritability, insomnia. I'd say the main things with the loss of progesterone is mood and sleep issues. So you might notice now that you have trouble falling asleep, whereas you never did before, or you can get to sleep, but you wake up so many times throughout the night, whereas you never did before, and or you struggle to get back to sleep when you wake up. Things like that, mood issues, irritability, feeling unsure of yourself. A lot of women have said, and I definitely have those symptoms when I know my progesterone is super low just before my next cycle, where you feel unsure of yourself. You're not sure. You don't feel, yeah, you almost like you. Sometimes I've heard women say, I just don't even want to get in my car. I don't want to drive. It's these kind of mood related symptoms and anxiety, irritability, those sorts of things, and sleep. Those are huge. And then, yeah, just looking at your period. You having more painful breasts, maybe that you didn't have before, or they're just more painful now. But again, those symptoms can, be needs as well. So no, in terms of testing, nothing. It's really just about going with symptoms, where you are in the stage of life, and yeah, you're probably perimenopausal if you have those symptoms. But testing can help. So you and I both use the Dutch test with clients. What I love about that is, yeah, you'll be able to see things. It is just a snapshot in time, but you will be able to see things like progesterone production. Again, it's just a snapshot for that month that you did it. But you will get an idea of estrogen, but you also get with the Dutch test an idea of, you look at how your liver is breaking down estrogen, because it gets broken down via 3 different pathways. So not to get too geeky or confusing, it needs to be, ideally we want those pathways, we want that breakdown of estrogen in the liver to be done healthily and effectively. And the Dutch test shows all of that. So that's really helpful. And it also shows cortisol. So you get an idea of your stress response in terms of what your cortisol is looking like in the test. So that's my answer.
I really like using the Dutch test, even though, as you say, it is just a snapshot. But I think understanding what someone's cortisol is doing is really helpful, because that's going to have a bearing on the sex hormones. And then also the metabolism is really helpful just to see, because even if someone wants to do HRT or hormone replacement therapy, we want to make sure that the metabolism is really healthy. So, if your own endogenous hormones are not going down the healthy pathways, we really want to work on that before we start putting extra exogenous hormones into the system. So, even though, as you say, it is just a snapshot in time, it's really, really useful in terms of just getting an understanding of what's going on under the hood, and kind of just what your body needs for support generally, irrespective of perimenopause, just as a whole. It can be very insightful.
Yeah, definitely. I love using it. If a client's happy to use it, I think it's a fantastic tool.
Yeah, and so for people listening, that's the Dutch complete Dutch hormones. It's a urine test that you can do. It needs to be ordered through a practitioner like myself or Francesca, and you can't just do it on your own. If you did, you probably get a little bit stuck in interpreting the reports when they came through. But really, really helpful test to investigate further. Is there anything else you want to add, Francesca, before we wrap up?
No, I think that's everything. I think we mentioned much. Obviously, we talked about the diet, but also optimizing gut health is something that I would always touch on, approach with every client as well, because I mentioned a little bit earlier that there is a final phase of the detoxification of estrogen once we've used it, and that is out through a bowel movement. So if your digestive system is in any way compromised, it can impact that. And it's not just the bowel movement that we need to look at, it's other little things like the balance of beneficial and friendly and unfriendly bacteria, because some types of unfriendly bacteria can actually cause the reabsorption of broken down estrogen to go back into circulation. So you would definitely want to be addressing digestion as well.
Yeah, and we can go into a little bit more detail into that when we talk about estrogen next week.
Yes.
Good. So Francesca, tell us, where can people find you? Maybe they're suspecting, maybe they're in perimenopause, they're struggling a bit, they need a little bit of help. How do they get that from you?
Well, I'm actually doing a free hormone balancing webinar on Monday, the 8th of November. I haven't started posting about it yet, but there's a link to that in my bio, my Instagram bio. So you can register for that and come along to that. Be like an hour and a half on Monday the 8th. It'll also be recorded, so if you register and you can't come, you'll get the recording afterwards. So that will be a nice deep dive and lots of tips to go away with. And then so also if you just go to my website, which is francescaliparoti.com, you can access that free webinar registration. I have a free guide on my website, 6 steps to rebalancing your hormones, which kind of talk everything that we talked about today really in more detail. And then there's my work with me page, so you can see on there how I work in terms of like one-to-one and my group program, which I'm starting in January.
Okay, amazing. Well, thank you so much for being here today and sharing your wisdom with you. I think with you, with me, with us, with all of us. And I think next week, Wednesday afternoon, I believe we are due to now go a little bit deeper into estrogen, I think is the next
Yeah.
one coming up. So that'll be exact same format as today. We will go live, and if you obviously can't attend live on the Wednesday afternoon, you can catch the replay. Do let us know if you have any questions. Do let us know if you found this helpful. And we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you for having me.
Everyone. Bye.